Hi, I'm Dr. Gil Welch. In this Less Medicine, More Health short take, we'll consider the distinction between absolute versus relative change. There are two ways to say the same thing, except one of them, the relative change, always feels like a bigger effect. I bring this up in Assumption 1. All risks can be lowered. And to be sure, medical care can reduce some risks, but the effort is most likely to be successful when the risk is high. Consider someone at a very high chance of having something bad happen in the next 5 years, say 50%. Medical care can sometimes dramatically lower such risk, even cut them in half, as is the case with treating patients with very, very high blood pressure. But most of us are not at very high risk. Our chance of something bad happening in the next 5 or 10 years is maybe 2 or 3%. It's hard to lower an already low risk. I bring this up in the context of my mother, where I write, cutting a below average risk in half turns out to be a pretty small effect. That sentence is alluding to the distinction between absolute versus relative change. If you can do subtraction and you can do division, you'll understand the distinction. Consider the following example. Let's say you're buying a car that lists for $50,000. For the moment, we'll pass on the question of why you're buying a car for $50,000. But you're able to get it for $25,000. How much did you save? First, do the subtraction. 50 minus 25, that's $25,000. Then do the division. You got 50% off. The subtraction is the absolute change. The division is the relative change. Now another example. Let's say you're buying a popsicle that lists for $2, but you get it for $1. How much did you save? First, do the subtraction. 2 minus 1, you saved $1. Now, do the division. You saved 50% off. And now you see the problem. A relative change provides no information about the question 50% off from what? You want a medical example? Consider this. The typical 60-year-old American has a 3% chance of dying from colon cancer in the next 30 years. That's the so-called baseline risk. If that individual undergoes regular colon cancer screening, the chance of dying from colon cancer in the next 30 years falls to 2%. How big is the benefit of screening? That's another version of the question, how much did you save? Remember, there's subtraction and there's division. First, do the subtraction. 3% minus 2%, it's a 1% savings. Then do the division. It's 33% off. The subtraction is the absolute change, the division is the relative change. And if you want to know how the relative change is calculated, it's taking the absolute change over the baseline risk. The absolute change is 1%, the baseline risk is 3%, that's 33% off. Now let's consider the take-home message. The absolute change, screening reduces your risk of colon cancer death in the next 30 years by 1 percentage point. The division, the relative change, screening reduces your risk of colon cancer death by 1/3, or 33%. Again, these are two ways of saying the same thing. But does it matter how you say it? Sure it does. The relative change feels much bigger. The effect of medical interventions are typically expressed in relative terms because, 1, relative measures are more familiar. That's a good reason. The second reason is not so good. Relative measures tend to exaggerate effects, both the perception of risk and the perceptions of benefit. Absolute change and relative change go under a variety of labels. There's an absolute change in rate, there's an absolute change in risk, there's an absolute risk increase, absolute risk reduction, and the relative change may be called a relative rate or a relative risk. If you want to know more, I suggest you read the supplemental reading. The article is called "The Problem is Relative." It won't take you long, less than 5 minutes. And remember that relative measures tend to exaggerate effects, both the perceptions of risk and the perceptions of benefits. It's a way to sell news. It's also a way to sell product. The assumption is all risks can be lowered. But it turns out it's pretty hard to reduce an already small risk, and all of our interventions pose some harm. The disturbing truth is risks can't always be lowered, and trying creates risks of its own. I hope this helps. Thanks.